Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Oren Gross. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here at Minnesota Law. I am also the chair of our International Law Concentration. It is a distinct pleasure to welcome you to this event of the Human Rights Center, which is also a part of our Alumni Week. It's really nice to see many familiar faces, both in the room. I understand that there are about 1 million people that are watching it on Zoom, so hello to the people on Zoom. And so on behalf of the law school, I want to welcome everybody. First of all, I want to start with alumni. And specifically, since I see several of you here, do we have any alumni here who are celebrating milestone reunion? What number? 50. Okay. I have a feeling that nobody's going to beat that one. Any other milestone reunions? 50 is a big. Oh. 20? 20 is good. 30? Excellent. So, I mean, this sounds a bit like a reverse auction, right? We start with 15, go down, but welcome you all back to the law school. 50, was that still in Fraser or still in Fraser Hall? For those, all I can say is certainly for the current students, you don't know how lucky you are to be in this building, but we can talk more about this. Welcome also to our current students. Welcome, I see several current faculty, emeriti faculty. I want to also acknowledge winners of the Human Rights Center Awards. And if you, by any chance, if you do not fall into any of the categories that I mentioned so far, welcome anyways. International law in general, human rights in particular, are essential components, both to the history of this law school and to its ongoing mission. Minnesota law has maintained a particular excellence in these fields, recruiting top-notch scholars, this present company excluded, excellent students, and remarkable staff. The Human Rights Center is no exception to that, and in many ways is really at the forefront of what we do and teach here at the law school. The center was established in 1988 by my late colleague and friend David Weisbrod, who served as the founding director of the center and brought it to national and international prominence. In 2015, Professor Fionnuala Ní Éileann replaced David as the academic director of the center. Professor Ní Éileann is a world-leading expert in the fields of international law, human rights law, national security law, emergency powers, transitional justice, international criminal law, feminist legal theory. Basically, she teaches the whole curriculum. Describing her achievements both in academia and beyond will easily take the full hour, and so because I don't want to do that, I will only give you some highlights. Professor Ní Éileann is a University of Minnesota Regents Professor, one of only 30 professors throughout the university, and holder of the Robina Chair in Law, Public Policy, and Society. Until 2023, she also served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. She was elected that year to the International Commission of Jurists, and last year in 2024, she was appointed Honorary King's Counsel by His Majesty Charles III, the King of England. She's an elected member of the American Law Institute, an honorary fellow of the Royal Irish Academy, Ireland's leading body of experts in the sciences and humanities. She's the author of 10 books, with 3 underway, and dozens of articles. And doing all of that, she won numerous prestigious academic awards. Fionnuala, the floor is yours.
Have the Associate Dean and my husband introduce me every day, so that's a pretty good deal. Thank you all. It's lovely, lovely to be here. And this is a particularly lovely event for the Human Rights Center. It was really Amanda's idea several years ago that we would take this week when so many of you come back to the University of Minnesota Law School, and use it as a way to share with you what we do, what we think about, and to often not just give you CLE credits, but give you an insight into the kind of living heartbeat of what the Human Rights Center does every day. So I also want to thank Amanda, particularly, who's our executive director, and Abby Nelson, who's the program coordinator at the Human Rights Center. Events like these don't just happen. They take a lot of work over several months and years to pull them together. So many thanks to them. As Professor Gross said, the Human Rights Center is one of the oldest centers in the country, and our mission was and remains to keep human rights at the center of what the law school does, to be relevant to our communities here in the Twin Cities and beyond. And I think that mission has never been more important. We're acutely aware of the burdens of maintaining a voice for human rights at the present minute. And I think there are a number of things that are really important, and we're glad Jeff is here to help us do some of these things. First is to continue to stress the importance of solidarity and community at the moment when both of those things feel enormously under stress and are meant to. The second is to underscore the importance of lawyers and lawyering in this moment of challenge. The third, something we shouldn't take for granted, is the absolute essential thing that a university is to a democratic and open society. And finally, and this is really the start of my introduction to Jeff, is to talk about and continue to stress the importance of labor, fair employment, and the rule of law in the workplace and in the organization of business. And so with that in mind, I want to introduce Jeff, who is a triple gopher. Okay, there's, I think, a reason to cheer. Jeff has spent many years here, collected numerous degrees. We were counting them over dinner last night. But also, I'm really pleased to say Jeff was part of the Human Rights Center, was part of Jeff's journey as a student here at the law school. He received a 2004 Human Rights Center Fellowship from my predecessor, David Weisbrod. And David put people in lots of places, but he put David at the ILO in Geneva. And I hope that was one of the formative things that led him to the work he's doing today. He also found him housing, and I can say he did that for us too. So he had a side business in real estate as well as his academic pursuits. Jeff Vockrodt is the Fair Labor Association's president and CAO. He was appointed by a 19-member board of directors. And one of the really unusual things about this organization, as we learned last night, is that it includes equal representation from companies, universities, and civil society organizations. And it has an independent chair, who is, I think, currently Mike Posner, an old friend of the Human Rights Center. Jeff has been working for many decades now to advance workers' rights and responsible business practices. He's been an organizer, he's been a lawyer, he's been a policymaker, and he is also an executive. He's held multiple leadership positions, including at the US Department of Labor and at an organization called Climate Jobs New York. And he has continued in all of those places to advance human rights in the workplace. That has been central to what he's done. He's recognized as a nonprofit leader, and I think one of the things that defines him is that just the variety of really interesting that commitment, not just to labor and human rights, but also increasingly to climate justice and climate action. So he has a BSB, a JD, an MPP, and an MBA from the University of Minnesota. We're trying, the Associate Dean was trying to convince him to come back over dinner last night and do an LLM, because it was the one degree we thought he didn't have. He serves on multiple boards. He lectures frequently, and we are really, really pleased that he is our guest lecturer tonight, this evening, at the Spring Alumni Week Human Rights Center event. So, Jeff, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's a generous introduction. It's a real honor to be on a program with Professor Gross and Professor Neil Lane, giants in international law and human rights, and also to be hosted by the Human Rights Center. As was mentioned, I was a fellow of the Human Rights Center, and David did find me my apartment in Geneva. So that's what enabled me to work at the ILO, which definitely was a part of forming my journey here. It's also great to be back at the place where I studied law at a time when the rule of law and preserving the rule of law is front and center. And I'm very happy to be talking about today's topic, which is operationalizing human rights due diligence in supply chains. I view the Fair Labor Association as existing entirely to put human rights into practice, to make it practical. And so this is a topic that's very, very close to my heart. So I am going to run through the following, but want to preserve lots of time for discussion at the end. But I'll give you a bit of a background on the Fair Labor Association and our work. It is not at all my intention to make this an advertisement for FLA, but it will give you a sense of where I come from. And also, we are going to draw on FLA's work as some practical examples of. I will talk a bit about the evolving regulatory environment as a backdrop. That itself could be a very long presentation and session, but just to give you an overview of where it stands and to highlight the current uncertainty in where that regulation is going. Share a few thoughts on navigating that uncertainty, and then focus on some practical examples. Then I'll share a few thoughts on just some overarching trends that I have my eye on that I suggest keep an eye on going forward, and then we'll have a discussion. That's the plan. And about the Fair Labor Association, I think our most important feature is what Professor Neil Lane already mentioned. You have a governance structure with equal representation from business, universities. I think that is really fundamentally important to keeping us on the right track and fundamentally important to our effectiveness. And just to give you a brief sense of the history, the FLA came about in the 1990s, partly as a result of the student movement on college campuses saying that it was unacceptable the way college sweatshirts, college jerseys were being manufactured in supply chains around the world. And that was one of the main factors that caused President Clinton to bring together the biggest apparel and footwear companies, the largest universities, and also major civil society organizations to take on that challenge. It was originally called the Apparel Industry Partnership and then became the FLA when they made it. And maintaining that tripartite governance structure is very important. We started out in apparel and footwear, and that's still where we have the largest footprint, but we have a growing presence in agricultural commodities. Food going into fragrance, beauty products, and that is an area where the organization really started investing about 15 years ago because a lot of what we were doing in apparel and footwear could be applied in that setting, and agriculture was the place. So, and I think this slide is already out of date. Speaking of agriculture, the L'Oreal Group has recently joined and continued to build out our agricultural presence. And similarly, we started with a real focus in the United States. We still have a lot of members based here, but we have become very, and we have a staff organized to reflect that and to effectuate that model. So we have staff based in 13 countries on 5 continents, and then of course we have implementing partners and investigators, assessors, and so on. So it has become a very global presence, and obviously there are real advantages to that. Growing influence, the ability to level the playing field, the ability for more and more companies to work together. Just a quick overview of our work. I think of it in 3 buckets. The first, and really where we started and still essential to our work, So we have 2 accreditation programs, one for manufacturing, one for agricultural commodities. When a company is voted in as a member of the FLA, and our board votes on every membership application, that's a recognition that that company is committed to investing in this work and doing what it takes to implement our standards. So once they're voted in, they go through a process of about 5 years of putting in place, aligning their code of conduct, but also putting in place the internal infrastructure in order to effectively. If they're successful, then our board votes again to accredit that company, and they're subject to ongoing monitoring. And I think it's important to note that when we accredit a company, we're accrediting their rights program and the fact that they have invested in systematically and scalably taking on, addressing human rights, finding problems where they exist, remediating. It is not a certification to say that there will never be, there are no problems in a particular product. So that's accountability, and we'll talk more about some of those. Increasingly important is our work on collective action across companies, especially the deeper you go into the supply chain, the more important it is for companies to work together, take on systemic challenges that are bigger than any one company or any one supply chain. And so we have brought companies together to do that, to collectively engage stakeholders, collectively remediate. And that's increasingly important. We'll talk more about that too. And we have a lot of ongoing innovation work where we're doing research, we're developing new models, and so on. So that's a broad look at our work. And before moving forward, I think it's worth just mentioning, why do companies do this in the first place? Because it's a significant commitment of resources, it's a significant commitment to transparency, to accountability, and so why would a company take that? And just very briefly, I think there are 4 reasons. One is that we really help companies walk step by step through the process of building a human rights program, which is valuable to companies when there are a number of incentives for them to do that. So having the ability to get that guidance is worth a lot. We also help companies prepare to comply for a variety of regulations, which we'll come back to. We help investors and consumers and regulators make choices, and that's something companies understand and value, and also just the network of companies and the opportunity to come together and figure out how to take on human rights challenges with their peers. A lot of value. So that is why companies take the step of becoming members of the Fair Labor Association. And I sometimes say on the subject of accountability, it's voluntary to be in the FLA, but once you're in, none of this is voluntary. And we'll talk more about that. But this is why companies take the step. So the evolving regulatory landscape, and it is rapidly evolving, sort of week by week. I'll give you a brief overview, and we can come back to any of this, but give you a sense, and starting with the European Union. So and because I think the EU is kind of the center of gravity on this broader trend toward mandatory regimes to move that forward, last summer, the European Parliament passed the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CS. And that was 5 years in the making, and perfect, but it was a major step. They had really worked to try to find the right balance on a number of things. And it passed last June, I think. And we all thought, okay, we know where we're going with this. We know what's coming. I'll come back to why that's now in question. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is already in effect for some companies. Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive requiring certain kinds of reporting on sustainability work, and that is done through the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And then there's also a separate taxonomy regulation, which just defines a number of terms that get used in companies' reports to have consistency and clarity, saying things that aren't necessarily. So all of this is kind of the backdrop, and then earlier this year, the European Commission issued an omnibus proposal to simplify and harmonize those various sustainability regulations. That's the theory, is simplify and harmonize. I think in essence, it really rewrote all of this, or went down the pathway of rewriting. And so there are essentially two elements of that omnibus proposal. The stop the clock part has already passed both the Parliament and the Council, and that just moves back the implementation of CSDDD by a year, and also moves back the requirements for reporting under CSRD for almost all companies. So it makes sense. If you're going to throw the nature of regulation into doubt, probably delay the implementation. So that has already passed. And then there's the substantive part of it, which proposes to remake these various regulations. And so we're in this period of uncertainty where nobody knows exactly where it's going to land. I'll highlight just a few of the, I think, some of the crucial changes in the omnibus proposal from the Diligence Directive. The biggest one, I think, is that it moves away from a risk-based approach where you assess risk across your supply chain and then put your efforts where it's most needed, which I think is the most practical and also the most effective approach. Moves away from that to an approach that just focuses almost uniformly on direct suppliers, what we might call tier one. And part of what they're trying to do with the omnibus proposal is to make it less burdensome on small and medium-sized enterprise, but in fact, I think they've done the opposite. They've set up a system where, with very little regard to risk assessment, direct suppliers, tier one suppliers, are just bombarded requests across the board. So they've kind of done the opposite of what they set out to do, and I think undermine the most practical approach to taking on human rights challenges in supply chains. It also significantly limited the scope of stakeholder engagement that's built into due diligence, and I think stakeholder engagement is fundamentally important. And then it also implemented or proposed limitations on what companies can ask of their suppliers. And there again, the goal was to reduce the burden on small and medium-sized enterprise. But it does put a real onus on a company to justify when it's just trying to get basic information, that it needs risk management or compliance with a variety of regulations. So needless to say, I think the omnibus proposal doesn't go in the right direction, in my opinion. And it is interesting. I was in Brussels a few weeks ago, and not only have they kind of pushed aside the substance of CSDDD, but also it's sort of a different cast of characters. Mission at the council, in the parliament, it's sort of a new crew, rather than the people who spent the last 5 years or so really digging in, understanding this and making thoughtful balances. So it is, you know, we're in a period of uncertainty and of political changes. That's the EU. And so that says national laws. I'll run through a few of these. The German Supply Chain Act was already in effect, is already in effect, but there has been a movement to either delay or do away with it in the wake of CSDDD. The idea being, let's wait and implement the Europe-wide due diligence directive. So they have, Germany has delayed reporting requirements under the German Supply Chain Act. And the new coalition government formed in Germany seems intent on just doing away with the law. The theory being that they will then create a new law to implement the diligence directive, but it is sort of setting back regulatory requirements. The Norwegian Transparency Act is in effect. The French corporate duty of vigilance law is also similarly in effect. There are regulations developing in other jurisdictions. I would highlight California, that has the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, which is focused on forced labor, and also the new Assembly Bill 3234, which is focused on disclosures around child labor. And as everyone knows, when you have a leadership vacuum of any kind, you have developments in other areas, and we can expect California and I think other states to try to move this kind of regulation forward. Can be very productive, can also create a kind of patchwork of regulation that's very difficult to comply with. We've been watching that even within Europe. In diligence directive, trying to avoid a patchwork of national laws implementing that. I think it's a similar dynamic if we see states. Again, not to say it's a bad thing, but it can be very challenging and inefficient, and maybe take away from achieving the goal of improving workers' lives. But we can, I think, watch those developments in states. New York has the Fashion Act currently under consideration. Political future of that, but supply chain due diligence. And then I'll also just highlight the related regulatory development of forced labor bans. And it's not a due diligence requirement, but it's sort of the flip side of a due diligence requirement. So the prohibition on importing products that had forced labor. The US led the way on this and has been enforcing particularly the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act by stopping shipments at the border, and really has changed the way companies think about forced labor. And that recent enforcement, and then the European Union recently adopted their own version of a forced labor ban called the Forced Labor Regulation, taking a somewhat similar approach. And those, the connection to due diligence is if you have a withhold release order, for example, in order to respond to that, you probably should have done your due diligence and be able to speak. There are some interesting tensions between due diligence requirements and the forced labor ban. But all of this is to say, number one, the trend of moving toward mandatory due diligence in regulation, clearly a trend that is with us, that is continue, but the precise nature of those regulations is hard for companies to plan. And one other thing I would just highlight, in the same vein that these regulations are not going away, another thing that's not going away, factors into companies' decision-making, is the regular reports by advocacy. And I think we've seen an increase of that over the last couple of years. So that I think is also another incentive for companies to take this environment ends up being. That's where we are. There is a lot of regulatory uncertainty. So if a company is trying to move forward on human rights due diligence, where do you go? Where do you anchor it? And a couple of thoughts on that. So the two crucial reference points are the UN Guiding Principles on Business Rights and the ILO conventions and the ILO standards. I think those are broadly recognized as key touch points as we think about what are human rights expectations. But they're also a little bit hard to turn into implementation. The specific requirements aren't always clear. And so I think maybe the most crucial reference point is the OECD guidance which is really designed to implement and is becoming more and more of a well-recognized touchstone. So that's a basic six-step process of aligning the code, embedding the principles, identifying and assessing adverse impacts. I think risk assessment is fundamentally important in this. It helps you focus within an almost impossible landscape, and it also makes sure then stopping what you're doing that's causing adverse impacts, tracking implementation of results, communicating about that, and crucially mediating. And that can be an individual company, it can be companies coming together to remediate. But remediation is so I would say the OECD guidance is the most widely recognized, the most stable reference point for somebody trying to, how do I do due diligence? And the other thing I would say is that obviously FLA is one example, certainly not the only one. The other thing to do in a moment of uncertainty is to invest in things that you can be confident are credible, robust, practical, effective forms of human rights due diligence, whatever the regulation is going to be. So from there to some practical examples. So a holistic example for a company implementing human rights program in their supply chain, an example of collective action, an example of a targeted tool. And we have a number of others beyond FLA that are used. So starting with the holistic accreditation, we talked a bit about that. And that really helps companies go through a process of putting in place the infrastructure to be able to promote human rights. And we often think about resources as a primary challenge when you're going to address human rights supply chain. But the challenge that we don't always think about is inertia. It can be very hard to turn a large company, turn a large ship, and change the way a large organization does business. And so to be able to do that in a step-by-step way is really valuable. And I think that's one of the attributes of accreditation, and whatever approach you take, being able to do it kind of step-by-step, because you can't implement a diligence program in one go. So that I would highlight in connection with accreditation. And just to illustrate, our Fair Labor Code is built around exactly what you would expect in terms of thematic areas, which translates into a set of principles for agriculture and a very similar set of principles for manufacturing. And I think crucially is packaged in terms of milestones that a company can go through the process of aligning a code, getting clear commitment from the highest executives to process and so that's kind of putting in place a holistic human rights program. And again, I think the crucial element there is just having all at once. And a complement to that in the case of FLA, is our fair labor investigations. So, as I mentioned earlier, any third party can file a complaint with FLA saying that one of our companies isn't living up to it. And if it's within our scope, we'll have an independent investigator do an independent investigation, make recommendations, and our companies are required to cooperate, participate in that investigation, and also required to implement. And I think that's a crucial complement to having the systemic. So that's an example of kind of building a holistic human rights program. And then I want to really highlight the importance of collaboration across companies, because everywhere I go, I hear about the importance of collective action, collective remediation. And that's from companies trying to do work that they can't do on their own. It's from NGOs, from worker advocates, recognizing that these challenges have to be addressed in a systemic way. So we are, at FLA, actively engaged in collective stakeholder engagement, important for companies and for profit organizations. Collective remediation. We're piloting collective risk assessment across companies to help, target that collective action in a way. Harvesting the Future is probably the best example of collective action. And it has evolved over the past 5 or 6 years. Started with hazelnuts in Turkey, and we brought together the largest buyers of hazelnuts from Turkey, and in fact, it accounted for well over 90% of purchasing of hazelnuts from Turkey. All of the major buyers represented, and got them to invest through us in systematic, hired general contractors, refurbished schools, we created child labor-free zones, these kinds of things that that are very difficult for a single company to do, but much more effectively. So from hazelnuts in Turkey, it's gone to 9 different commodities, 3 countries, Turkey, Egypt, India, but the model is essentially the same. Bringing together the largest buyers and then investing. And it's a very resource-intensive model, so we've designed it so that at any given in any given country for any given commodity, you designed to be self-sustaining. So you spend 4 years building the effort, and you set it up so that in partnership across the national or regional government and local stakeholders and companies, that it will continue without FLA. That's the goal. I think we haven't been at it long enough to really validate that, but I think that's an important part of the design, because if we can do that, then we can move on to other areas. And so this just gives you a sense of the various players. I think one key part of this is that we really don't rely on governments for much of anything, but we do partner with them where possible and where it's effective. And in this kind of systematic action, the government can be a really important. So in every case, we have brought the government in as this is just a quick look at some of the numbers associated with the program, and also the kind of outcomes or outputs that we. So again, collective action across companies, pre-competitive collaboration, really crucial to having an impact on systemic challenges like child labor. So we've looked at a kind of building a human rights program within an individual company, companies working together. And then one other example I would highlight is a particular tool that helps companies. So we've built a suite of living wage tools that help companies do that. So it's built into our code of conduct. That's the starting point, but then another matter to so we took this approach over the course of the last 7 years of collecting data, analyzing, building toward clear commitments of all of our members toward living wage, and then continuing to drive progress within companies and iterate on it. So the suite of tools includes the ability to collect data from your suppliers fairly easily. And this gives you a sense of kind of the data points in play there. And then we recognize that there are a number of ways of looking at living wage. We have a kind of a go-to methodology, which was created by Richard and Martha Anker. It's the one Global Living Wage Coalition uses. But we recognize there are a number of ways of looking at it. So we've built in the ability of comparing what you're doing or what your suppliers are doing in a given country against all of those benchmarks to be able to see where you are and track progress over time. So this is just an example of that. So, and obviously there are advantages to having this tool that updated by FLA. So this example of kind of a targeted tool, there are several of them. We created a human rights and environmental due diligence tool for companies to assess the maturity of their due diligence on own operations, supply chain, with contractors, and so on. But this is an example of that. And we've continued to do pilots on living wage. I'll just briefly mention one of the really interesting findings from the pilot in Vietnam was the crucial nature of worker input. And the factories where workers played an active role in figuring out how costing and pricing were going to relate to a living wage, those workers valued the resulting wage increase far more as opposed to the factories where the workers really weren't. I think worker engagement is crucial in any case, but I think that was a particular. So before I stop and we go into more of a discussion, I'll just briefly talk about a few overarching trends that are very much on my mind. The first we've already talked a lot about, which is the trend toward mandatory due diligence. I think the potential there is tremendous to improve workers' lives and also level the playing field for companies. But that is a trend that is remaking the way, I think, for the better. The second thing is artificial intelligence, and obviously AI is remaking everything. But I think it has particular implications for work on human rights and supply chain. There's sort of three premises that my thinking on AI flows from. So the first is that I think it's important that human rights keep pace with climate and with supply chain management in general in terms of advancing the uses of AI. That human rights will just get left. And so I'm working to do what I can to try to keep human rights in that mix as supply chain management moves forward, harnessing AI. The second thing is I think AI will be at least as important for human rights as it is for climate. Because in climate, you're dealing with pretty easily analyzed data. You're talking about forest cover or temperature or things that are pretty easy to work with. With human rights, you're dealing with worker stories, you're dealing with human data, which is inherently messy. And so the ability to make sense of that and to translate it into action AI can be hugely helpful in that. Now, the risks are bigger because you can't violate the privacy rights of a particulate. You can violate the privacy rights of a worker. So the risks are heightened, but I think the potential is. The third premise is that AI will really significantly elevate the importance of subject matter expertise of the kind I know many have with respect to human rights. And what I mean by that is, I think in the very near future, every organization will have at least one AI agent that is well-versed in the work of the organization. And we might say has somewhat of a deep understanding, is a day-to-day partner. And that combined with the ability of AI to code and to create new tech tools, I think, and the coding ability of AI is skyrocketing. It's completely different from what it was 4 months ago. I'm sure that trajectory will continue. So for me, that translates into a nonprofit that operates in a very lean way, can create new tech tools to address challenges, to take advantage of opportunities much more cheaply, much more quickly, with relying much less on tech expertise. So if you think of the living wage suite of tools that we talked about, it's great. Companies love it. It's won awards. All of our members use it. A number of other companies use it. It's had a really significant impact, but it took a long time to develop. It cost a lot to develop. So if we could do that kind of thing on a monthly basis, relying heavily on our domain expertise and not needing tech expertise, I think it has possibilities. Tech tools on their own can't do much, but if they're built into a broader effort. So that's a very long way of saying artificial intelligence, I think, has really implications for how we do this work. And finally, of course, climate. And there are a variety of ways that shows up. There are heightened risks for workers that are clear that we're already seeing. Extreme heat, flooding, and so on, and we have to be very attentive to that. And also looking at how we approach a transition in the economy, how that transition takes place, and also anytime you make significant change in an economy, you have an opportunity to make good choices. And so that's so those are just three overarching trends that I think will. I'll stop there and discussion.
All right. Well, so that's, I think, gives us a ton to talk about. And I know that there are quite a few people in the room that would have a lot to, I think, add and kind of dig into some of the questions here that we heard from Jeff. And so I think the plan for the time that we have remaining is since I got here first, I get to ask my questions first. I just have a couple questions to get us started, and then we'll invite all of you, anyone in the audience that would like to join in the conversation. We have some microphones that will run around, so I hope you'll get your questions ready. And I guess, Jeff, for me, the kind of first question I wanted to start with is something that we talk a lot about at the center, and when I went into the files and I kind of pulled up your fellowship report from 2004 when you were a Human Rights Center fellow, I was looking at some of the reflections that the center had asked you to do, and one of your observations coming back from having worked at the ILO was that human rights work at the international level is great, but local work is crucial to ultimate success, which I thought was a profound observation, especially having spent time in Geneva, that was your takeaway. And so I was curious now, kind of 20 years deeper into that path, how do you see the connection between developments at the international level and the work that's done at a local level?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I would say it exactly that way today, but I do still feel that way. I mean, I hasten to say any international institution, and taking the ILO as an example, does crucial work. I had the opportunity to sit down on Monday with the current Director General of the ILO and talk a lot about the challenges that the organization is facing and where it's headed. And I think I have a heightened appreciation for the role of the ILO at a time when its funding is very significantly under threat. So I just want to say that at the outset. But I do think, it has to be paired with on-the-ground action. And the reason that the FLA model, that I've respected it so much for the past couple decades and why I jumped at the chance when they called me was it's all about taking human rights standards and putting them into practice, making them practical, and tracking the implementation. And so I do think that complement of international standards, international leadership with very practical on-the-ground work is essential.
And that's kind of what I've been learning kind of through kind of our conversations to get ready for the event and the conversations since last night is kind of FLA as a place where that can really happen, where it make like a touch point for groups to bring grievances, a place for corporations to come and figure out how do we implement and bring these kind of on to the ground. And so I think organizations like FLA are doing the work of making those connections in powerful ways. But it's something that we hear from students quite a bit, either students that are really focused on doing work locally and start to see that maybe the international sphere can be connected to that, or students that are really keen on the UN and see that that doesn't exist in a vacuum, that it kind of requires this connection. And maybe a second kind of perennial question that comes up in conversations for us is, depending on kind of where you're having the conversation, the language and the framing that's used varies. And so we have some students and professionals are really familiar with language around ESG and corporate and social responsibility, and human rights doesn't always fit well in that framework, or vice versa. I'm just curious how you see either terminology that's really proper to the business field or labor movements or the international space. Do you find disconnects there, or how do you work to kind of make the connections?
Yeah, it's an important question. I mean, I think all of those can coexist very usefully, and the ability to talk to different audiences in different terms is not a bad thing. If I'm talking to investors and talking about risk management, that's broadly speaking where you need to be. So I don't think it's a bad thing that there are different terms to describe this, but I do. There is this idea that there's a distinction between human rights and labor, for example. And I spent a good bit of my career in the labor movement. I do think that democratically elected representatives of workers play a really fundamental role in any work on labor standards and human rights. And that is, organized labor, which is where I spent a lot of my career, is absolutely clearly labor, and I can certainly speak to that. But to me, it's very seamless with what we talk about at FLA as human rights at work, and the ability of workers to freely associate and all of that. A union is the gold standard version of that, and there's no substitute. But there isn't a union everywhere, and so you have to be able to make sure that workers do have the right to freedom of association, that these other safeguards are in place, even in situations where a union doesn't exist. So I think there's a real dovetailing there and a real seamlessness in my mind. And then with respect to ESG, I do think, I think that kind of those kinds of considerations in investment are not going away. I think most investors have a very sophisticated understanding of those considerations, of those factors, have a real appreciation of the role they play in risk and return. Whatever we call it, I think looking at social, environmental, governance factors is here to stay. So, I don't know the future of the terminology on that one, but the substance, I think, is with us.
Yeah, I really like the FLA's kind of mission and slogan of human rights at work, which might seem really subtle, but sometimes we have, like, you can have conversations and someone will say, oh, I don't do human rights, I do workers' rights. Or I don't do human rights, I do First Amendment. This idea that human rights somehow is a different category and doesn't count for other types, or I work on questions of poverty and development, not human rights. And so I actually think that we have a lot of work to do as a broader human rights movement to talk about how all of this fits, and there are important connections, because somehow these signals have created divides, and I love the FLA's kind of positioning of human rights at work. I think it's really effective. And I will keep it at that because I see a lot of faces that are here with us today that I know have expertise in this area, and so we would love to take questions that you might have in the audience if you want to comment on anything you heard or other questions for Jeff, and maybe I would just invite you also to please introduce yourself and let us know kind of who you are. Does anyone want to get us started? Yeah, please.
Well, thank you for that comprehensive presentation. My name is Steve Peterson. I'm a retiree. I'm a retiree celebrating one of my anniversaries here. With respect to your, I suppose you call your client a major retailer who comes on board and implements an aggressive due diligence program tracing its suppliers. How does it announce that change or that implementation? Does it intimate that there's been some insufficiency in their previous maintenance of supply chain? How do they come out and introduce them the fact that they've implemented these programs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the way companies communicate it varies quite a bit, but what is common to almost all of them is that they start from a position of needing to improve. I think if we worked with, obviously, if we worked with only companies that were starting from kind of basically doing everything right, the impact of that would be very limited. And the reality is every company that starts on this process has some way to go, some more than others. And so, in my experience, at least to us, companies are not shy about that. They recognize what is required of an FLA member. They recognize that there's a difference between where they are and where they need to be, and they're willing to invest in getting there. So I think how they talk publicly about that varies quite a bit, but in terms of interacting with them and working with them, I think every company is very, very open to that.
Two quick questions. First of all, thank you for the important work that you do. So I'll serve a bit of a devil's advocate. One is, and I guess following up, I can understand how the due diligence to get in quite robust, to get into the club. Wondering about what happens once you're in the club as far as reaccreditation, and how, has any company ever been unaccredited? What happens there? Mm-hmm. The second is, how do you respond to claim, especially of less developed countries, developing countries that are saying that labor standards are actually no different than tariffs? They're taking away their comparative advantages, they're taking away their ability to charge lower costs on labor and therefore push their products to the markets of more advanced countries.
So thank you. As to the first one, absolutely yes. There have definitely been companies that were not willing to live up to their commitments and either removed themselves or were removed. And just at the end of last year, we had a company that I won't name at the moment, but we did an investigation, and there was a pretty clear area of noncompliance. The recommendation was pretty clear based on our standards. And we always work very hard with companies to figure out how to make it work. Because, again, we're designed to be practical above all else. And it's absolutely a last resort to remove a company because it completely cuts off your future influence with them, completely cuts off your future impact. But we had this company who, at the end of the day, said, we don't plan to implement that recommendation. And my response was, well, then you can't be an FLA member. And they left. So that absolutely does happen. And as I say, it's a last resort, but it certainly does. On your second question, I certainly think that, especially when you're talking about human rights and international norms, and all of our standards are based on international norms, especially ILO conventions, but more broadly. I think that has to be respected, and you have to bring operations up to that level. And the answer has to be, in my opinion, sort of addressing shortfalls where they exist and bringing everybody up, rather than furthering a race to the bottom. So I know that's not as simple as that and easier said than done, but I think broadly speaking, that has to be the answer.
Hi, over here. Thanks for coming today. This is a great talk. I'm Jenny Weber. I'm a Master of Human Rights alum and also work in the space of business and human rights for a decade or so. I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about collective action. I think it's so key, but there's so many industries and spaces where that's not taking place. So how do you start doing collective remediation? And because sometimes there might be a crisis, and because of the news, you learn about what other companies are sharing that factory with you, but you haven't talked to them about remediation in the past. You don't have the structure of a FLA. So how do you go about starting that collective action with your industry peers?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I can only speak from the perspective of FLA because that's how I've done it and seen it done. But most of the times when we've, Harvesting the Future is a good example. Most of the cases where we've taken on a commodity in a high-risk country, it has been from a crisis of some kind, in the sense that, companies are rightly so, subject to media reports of problems in their supply chain, advocacy campaigns, investigative reports, whatever the case. And those, I think, play a really important role in all of this, in the ecosystem. Most of that work has resulted from something like that, where it's a media report or investigative report or something like that. And then companies recognize, okay, we're all kind of trying to respond to this, ships passing in the night, and that's unproductive, and we're not going to be successful. And so that's how that work originated, was some of our member companies coming to us and saying, can you coordinate us? Can you lead this? And then to be effective, we brought in a lot of companies who were not members. And so it became a broader tent. And that's really how most of that work has played out. The reason why I'm so interested in layering on collective risk assessment to the collective stakeholder engagement and collective remediation is because it allows us to move to a more kind of proactive, strategic approach to that collective action. And it's a little bit like, accreditation helps a lot of companies move from just kind of putting out fires to having a strategic, proactive approach to human rights in their supply chains. I think collective risk assessment will help us move in that direction to be more proactive, more strategic with the collective action. And that's why we're piloting that right now. So I don't really know the answer in the absence of FLA or something like it, but that's how it's worked for us.
Can I say, Jenny, just because it seems like also one of the ideas that's percolating around the guiding principles, the UN guiding principles, that's come under kind of, in general, the human rights system is kind of coming under a lot of attacks, that one of the big values that it could add, it being a soft law space, is that could be an existing skeleton for a corporation or industry that was looking for a place to kind of put some mobilizing or organizing, at least to do it around the guiding principles. So whether it's the forum in Geneva or the regional consultations or using some of the UN staff and support that exists to try to have that be a space where one doesn't already exist, because it does seem like the spaces that exist are in response to a crisis. And I don't know that it's happened yet, but it's something that you hear kind of proposed of where the principles have fallen short or the forums aren't achieving something, that maybe that's a way that it could be given some like new life if people were using it that way. And it does seem that the meetings around the guiding principles in the working group are increasing in interest and attention, that people are, it used to just, there were a few years, right, Charlie and I went, and it was just consultants, and nobody to consult with, right? They were all just there by themselves. And it seems now to be on the uptick, and so I would be curious to see if that was a match for anybody to use a space there. Yeah, maybe Susanna?
Hi, I'm Martin. I was just invited by these folks to come. Very fascinating conversation. I'm curious, when working with particularly like commodity products, where the commodities are traded internationally and prices can change day by day, you're working with farmers or working with organizations that are working with farmers, where, you know, let's say coffee or hazelnuts or cotton are harvest dependent, and things can change quickly, you know, with climate change or just even the daily price of the market influencing farm gate prices for, let's say, coffee beans. And those prices affect how much money the farmers make and how much they can pay their staff or pay themselves or, you know, improve their equipment year over year, often waiting, you know, for like buyers to say, yes, the product works or the product doesn't work based on quality. Working with members of the FLA, how do you kind of work to ensure that they're not going to drop people or, you know, race to the bottom and say, well, that's the daily market price, we're going to pay this, even if it's under a certain standard of wages or, you know, quality of life. Especially when your members, you know, have like their own interests in mind and their own sales to make for their consumers. How does that kind of like play into those conversations, which aren't easy, especially when the FLA isn't saying, well, here's the market price. The market is saying, here's the market price.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, you know, I would say the fluctuation in pricing and weather and harvests and all of that can make it easier or harder to live up to these things in the supply chain. But it doesn't obviate the need for it. And I think the ideal scenario or the better scenario, and what is mostly the case in our members' supply chains, is that they have a relationship with the farm or the farm system, and that's a fairly stable relationship, and that's the bulk of their the bulk of what they buy, and that allows you to put these things in place in the supply chain. But I mean, it becomes much more of a challenge when you're talking about commodity exchanges like what you're referring to, even in terms of traceability. It's not so easy. And, you know, so when you combine a lack of traceability and this kind of market-driven pricing in a very minute-to-minute sense, that can be a real challenge. And I think the less of that in these supply chains, the better. I think the other, it's not entirely avoidable, because to manage supply and to maintain operations, that plays a role. But I think the less of it, the better. It's also challenging in countries where the government controls the market for a particular commodity. I mean, that's a whole other challenge, both in terms of traceability and pricing and standards. And I don't have a great answer for you on that one. But the kinds of dynamics that you're talking about are you know, absolutely play a role.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Susanna Gibbons. I'm with the Carlson School of Management. I want to go back to the collective action question. There have been a number of collaborations that have been developed in the climate change world, particularly the Net Zero Banking Alliance, Climate Action 100+. What that ultimately led to was a lawsuit from the state of Texas against BlackRock, claiming that they were violating antitrust rules. That seems to me to be something that could be applied to any sort of collective action. Have you discussed that issue internally, and how do you deal with it preemptively?
Yeah, well, you know, we start every board meeting, every business caucus meeting with a reminder of the antitrust restrictions, right? That you don't talk about pricing, that you don't, you know, so it's absolutely built into what we do. I think, you know, broadly speaking, when you're talking about working together to address human rights in a pre-competitive way, there's a lot of room to operate there. But it is it's absolutely something to be thought about, no question.
Thank you. Paul Haller, just a community member, no affiliation with the law school, but comprehensive overview. I liked it. Now I have an elevator speech for FLA. What if somebody asked me for my elevator speech on FLA and China? What should I say?
Well, you know, China is a difficult situation. I think they've made it very hard for NGOs in general to operate or have visibility. There's also, you know, there's regulation in China that is kind of directly opposing to obligations under forced labor bans and so on. So it is a difficult scenario. What I would say is that we have seen a movement of companies diversifying their production away from China for a while, for a variety of reasons. So it's still a huge player, but it's less and less of a player, and who knows, maybe what's going on accelerates that, I don't know. But I guess that's what I would say is it's a difficult one because it's very difficult to have insight, to operate, but we are seeing a move away from sourcing there.
I think I'm next. Hi, I'm Elena Maycomber. I'm a recent graduate of the law school, and during my time here, I worked with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and I did a lot of their treaty monitoring for negotiations at the UN for the legally binding instrument on business and human rights. And that is a treaty process that is a lot of, as I'm sure you know, fragmentation and division between civil society and states and then organizations representing business. So I was wondering what role you would see FLA having in potentially creating consensus or agreement between all those different interests given your partnership in so many sectors.
And I'm sorry, what was the context for that?
For the UN legally binding instrument on human rights.
Well, we do engage, you know, with an eye toward encouraging practical, effective regulation of a variety of kinds. We do engage a lot in that, and because we kind of speak for this membership that crosses business and civil society and universities, I think that adds weight. So I'm not entirely sure in the context you're talking about. I've been more focused recently on the EU regulations that they're developing. I just think that's kind of the center of gravity on this topic at the moment, and I haven't been as engaged in that. But I think it could potentially be very much the same, that we can be a voice for effective, practical regulation or agreement.
Can I just say, and Elena's heard this a lot, I think quite a few people in the room maybe have been with us on several conversations that we've been having, kind of starting a couple years ago, thinking about Professor Weisbrodt's leadership and kind of really founding ideas and innovation in this field. And kind of this is the Minnesota arc that I see, for those of you that maybe don't know these references. Professor Weisbrodt, this is in the late 90s, early 2000s, started a process out of the law school with law students to push forward a set of draft norms in the UN, which would have been, had they kind of went forward, binding norms on multinational corporations, and that failed. Some of you have heard the story many times. And how I see, this is really a process that then prompts what becomes the voluntary set of guiding principles, which has massive reach. And so we kind of take a big Minnesota footprint on this big development. But what happened is that push for binding norms continued. So a lot of the same civil society organizations pushed still in the UN human rights system to keep working forward for a new treaty. And just last week there were negotiations on it. And in part the premise is that if we have states coming together in investment treaties, for example, creating rights to protect corporations in international development, in principle states could come together to kind of increase protections for human rights. And at the same time, the entire framework happening in the European Union is really separate from that. But I think we can see how advances in one place kind of forces other jurisdictions to kind of get their act together and figure out what they're going to do. And so there's this really kind of dispersed developments that are happening, and it's hard to keep track of all the different spaces, but each one is kind of prompting the other to kind of move forward. And so, yeah, Elena's done really interesting work, and there's some, like a really interesting database that's tracking some of that work that folks can see. But I always have to plug the Minnesota connections to all these arcs. I know Charlie's been waiting on a question if we have a microphone for him.
Yeah. So Brett McDonald I'm on the faculty here. So insofar as the standards here are still mostly voluntary, or the mandatory rules are still mostly disclosure that don't necessarily force you to do anything, just disclose what you're doing. Question arises, why do companies want to comply insofar as it's costly, which it is? And the answer often given is your employees, your investors, your customers care. So in the United States in the last few years, we've seen this backlash against ESG, certainly strong in the area of DEI, pretty strong in the area of climate change. So my question for you is, both in your American companies and maybe elsewhere in the kind of issues you work on, have you noticed that with the companies you're working with or trying to work with, that the anti-ESG backlash of the last few years is making them a little less enthusiastic, causing companies to fall back? Is not affecting you in the issues you work on, or what's been your experience with that?
Well, I have kind of the fortunate circumstances of working with companies that have opted in, that it's sort of self-selecting. And so I'm not sure my experience in the weeds with our companies is necessarily representative of industry in general. But I think there are enough other continuing incentives and just a longstanding commitment that survives that backlash. I do think in the case of investors, those sorts of considerations and questions are not going away, even if they change a bit, or even if the way we talk about them changes a bit. There's always when we talk about consumer sentiment, the upside is a little bit harder to nail down, but the downside is pretty clear. I mean, nobody wants to be satire on SNL, and then there are impacts to that in consumer behavior. So there's that risk. There is this evolving landscape of regulation. There's a variety of incentives that keep companies moving forward. And again, I have the lucky opportunity to work with companies that have made some level of commitment to this. But I find myself talking incessantly lately about FLA kind of as a source of stability, where companies can, whatever the regulation ends up being, they can confidently build a program, they can confidently invest in things that they know are credible, practical, impactful, and also that they can come together and continue to innovate and continue to build on that, but in a predictable way, not in a kind of unstable, chaotic way. So I think there's also a gravitation toward that, of saying a lot is changing, a lot of it is unpredictable, but if there are models that we can invest in and be confident about and continue to build toward, there's a lot of value, because these broader dynamics are not going away, even if they change in the short term. So, and I think part of what you're getting at, I've certainly seen companies change how they talk about what they're doing, but I've seen less change in what they're doing.
So I've got a double question. My name is Charlie Rounds. I actually am a donor to the fellowships of the Human Rights Center. So it's kind of great to see it was always a wise investment.
Thank you.
And I'm glad I just said I invest in the Human Rights Center before I ask the question, who cares about human rights? And I'm very specific here, and I would love you to put your Carlson hat on here, is how do you change the mindset of the consumer? Let's go to an American consumer, that human rights matter. I spoke at Professor Lyon's class a couple weeks ago, and I asked how many students in the room had ever had their rights violated, civil or human. And I don't think any of them raised their hands. And so how do you create this groundswell that would then help your member organizations? And two other quick questions. I didn't see Target as one of your members, but certainly they have a supply chain and source. Is there a reason? Third, real quickly, you put California up there as a model, and I wasn't sure exactly what it was, but is there a necessity of California-like states in the United States to bind together and pass similar legislation that would then create a larger power to help your work?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know about California as a model. I mean, I think they're moving in a good direction, and it's very natural in the absence of other kinds of leadership for states, and especially California has been historically the leader on that, to move forward. I think there is there's always a downside to kind of patchwork regulation, which gets at what you're talking about. But I think that may just be our reality for a while. In the US, in Europe, I haven't thought about the idea of states banding together, so I don't have any great insight on that, but it's an interesting thought. In terms of people caring about human rights, it is, and I'm always interested in what others in the room, because there are lots of people with lots of expertise here, have to say about that. It's a bit of a hard nut to crack, as you're implying, and even if consumers do care or say they care, the way that shows up in behavior is not, perfectly in line with that sentiment for a variety of reasons. So, I will say in the case of FLA, I think we carry much more weight with investors, with regulators, with audiences like that, partly because we don't certify products. We don't put our logo on a product and say this product is free of human rights challenges or human rights abuses, environmental problems in the supply chain. I think that's a very, very difficult thing to do, and we don't. We accredit the company's program, and therefore, they can talk about it at that level, but our logo doesn't show up on any products. So as FLA, the consumer isn't as much of a direct audience for us, although I encourage anybody to acquaint themselves with who the members are and to, act accordingly. But consumers tend to be a little bit less of an audience for us. I do think the downside risk is clearer. When a significant problem arises in a supply chain and that comes to the public attention, that does affect consumer behavior, at least for a while. It's harder to encourage consistent reward of companies with good practices at scale. But as I said, I just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And just because it isn't at the level that I would like it to be doesn't mean it's not there. I'm interested, Amanda, I'm interested in your thoughts on that one.
Well, I have a lot of them, and I'm gonna do my job as a moderator and resist telling you all of them. So the good news is that we have a reception starting upstairs at 5 o'clock. And so I would invite all of you to come join us at the Human Rights Center. Jeff, and all together we can have the conversation upstairs in Auerbach Commons. We still have about 5 minutes left, and we'd like to take a minute. First, we'll thank Jeff for his time and the great lecture and conversation.